There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a bride 2 hours before her wedding, and I had always imagined, in the ordinary, unexamined way one imagines one's own wedding day for years before it arrives, that mine would be the good kind, nerves, certainly, and a little breathlessness, but underneath it all a settled, private happiness, the sort you don't have to check as real because you can feel it in your chest like a second heartbeat. At 11 minutes past 11 on the 7th of June, standing in the gravel car park of Fenwick Hall with my wedding dress bunched in both fists to keep the hem off the ground, I discovered that the quiet I actually felt was the other kind entirely, the kind that comes not before joy but before a very great fall, the stillness of a held breath in the half-second after you have already understood something and just before you allow yourself to know it. I had gone out to Marcus's car for his cufflinks. My name is Charlotte Faraday, Lottie, to everyone except my mother, who has never in 31 years called me anything but the whole of it, and I had, by the morning of my wedding, spent 11 years building a small but respectable career as a film editor, which is a peculiar sort of profession to hold if you are the kind of person who prefers not to look too closely at things, because editing is, at its core, nothing but looking closely, at footage, at timing, at the half-second where a cut either works or betrays itself, at the tiny inconsistency in a story that tells you, if you are paying proper attention, that something has been staged. I mention this now because it matters to what follows. I was, on the morning of the 7th of June, exactly the sort of person who ought to have noticed a great deal sooner than I did. I had simply spent 11 years learning to look closely at other people's stories, and had never once thought to point that same unforgiving attention at my own. Marcus Vane and I met at a mutual friend's exhibition opening in Bristol, 18 months before the wedding, where he had stood in front of a photograph of a Scottish sea loch for a long time, longer than anyone else in the room, and told me, when I asked what had caught him, that it reminded him of somewhere his grandmother used to take him as a boy, though he could no longer remember exactly where. I found this, at the time, rather moving. I have since had a great deal of occasion to reconsider what, precisely, about Marcus Vane was ever true. He was 36, Australian by birth though he had lived in half a dozen countries since, funny in the low-key, self-deprecating way that English women apparently find catastrophically difficult to resist, and entirely without what I would now call a fixed address in his own life, no long-held job, no old friends who'd known him more than 4 or 5 years, a flat he rented month to stay flexible. I had found all of this charming, in the particular besotted stupidity of the first year, in the way you find a person's restlessness charming right up until the day you understand that restlessness was never a personality trait at all, but a strategy. He had proposed on Boxing Day, on the cliff path above Lyme Regis, with a ring that turned out, I would learn much later, to have been purchased on a credit card 2 days before its limit was reached, and I had said yes with the whole of my chest, the way you only ever get to say yes once, if you are lucky, in your entire life. There had been signs, of course. There are always signs, and I have come to believe that one of the cruelest tricks love plays on an otherwise perfectly sensible woman is convincing her that noticing a pattern is the same thing as being unkind. Marcus was, for instance, never once able to produce more than 2 or 3 old friends who had known him before the age of 30, and when I asked, gently, early on, why that was, he had a ready answer, a falling out with a business partner in Perth, a friendship group that had drifted after a messy divorce that wasn't even his own, and I had accepted each explanation individually, the way you accept a single stray thread on a jumper without ever quite noticing that the jumper is, in fact, unraveling. He was cagey, in a soft, deflecting way rather than a defensive one, about anything to do with paperwork. Our joint account, opened 4 months into the engagement at his gentle, persistent suggestion, always seemed to need topping up from my side rather than his, a fact I had explained to myself, at the time, as the ordinary imbalance of a relationship where I simply earned rather more than he did. He was, above all, extraordinarily good at redirecting a conversation the moment it drifted towards anything he did not wish to discuss, a skill so smooth I had genuinely never noticed it operating, in 18 months, as a skill at all, rather than simply the natural rhythm of how Marcus talked. I think, now, that this is the thing nobody tells you about a well-run deception: it does not feel, from the inside, like being lied to. It feels like being loved, rather well, by somebody who is simply a little vague about practical matters, and it is only afterwards, with the whole shape of it laid out in black and white on a stranger's phone, that you can see how carefully every one of those small vaguenesses had been built to serve a single, patient, unhurried purpose. The wedding was planned for 18 months later, at Fenwick Hall, a handsome grey stone country house on the edge of the Mendips that did weddings on weekends and corporate retreats during the week, with 140 guests and a marquee on the south lawn and a slideshow, my slideshow, the one I had spent 3 weekends in April building, cutting together photographs of us from the 18 months we'd known each other, set to music, meant to run during the speeches, sitting finished on a laptop in the AV cupboard behind the ballroom, waiting for its moment. I had gone out to the car park for his cufflinks because Marcus, with the particular vagueness he brought to every practical arrangement in his life, had left the small leather box containing them in the glove box of his car the night before so I wouldn't forget them in the rush, and had texted me, an hour before I was due to start getting dressed, to ask whether somebody could fetch them, since he was already at the church with his best man and couldn't come back for them himself. I went myself. I have wondered, since, whether things would have gone differently if I had sent my sister instead, and I have decided, on the whole, that I am glad I didn't. The car park at Fenwick Hall sits behind a line of ancient yews, gravel crunching underfoot, and Marcus's car, a silver hatchback he'd owned since before I met him, always slightly too untidy inside, always smelling faintly of the vanilla air freshener he'd never once replaced, was parked at the far end, beneath one of the yews, where he'd left it the previous evening after the rehearsal dinner. The glove box stuck, as it always did, and I had to pull twice before it gave, spilling out the usual accumulation of receipts and a half-eaten packet of mints and, tangled in the strap of an old pair of sunglasses, the small leather box I'd come for. I took it out. I was turning to go, the box already in my hand, my mind already 3 steps ahead on the practical business of the morning, hair appointment in 40 minutes, the florist's van due at past, when I saw, wedged into the narrow gap behind where the glove box door had been, a second phone. Not his ordinary phone, which I knew as well as I knew my own, a battered black iPhone with a cracked corner he'd never bothered to fix. This was a different handset entirely, an older model, plain and unremarkable, the sort of phone you buy for £40 from a supermarket and pay for in cash. I should have left it exactly where it was. I have asked myself many times since why I didn't, and the only honest answer I have ever arrived at is that 11 years of professional habit are not so easily switched off, and some instinct in me, the same instinct that has caught 1,000 small continuity errors in other people's footage, recognized, before the rest of me had caught up, that a hidden phone in a fiancé's glove box 2 hours before a wedding was not a detail. It was a story. The phone was not locked. I have thought, since, that this in itself tells you something about the sort of carelessness that eventually undoes people like Marcus Vane, that a man capable of sustaining a deception for 18 months could not be bothered to set a passcode on the one device that would expose it entirely. I sat down, quite suddenly, on the low stone wall beside the yew, my wedding dress pooling around me on the gravel, and I read. The messages went back 14 months, which was, I noted with a small, clinical detachment that I would later come to think of as the only thing that got me through that morning at all, almost exactly the point at which Marcus and I had become engaged. V. 14 months ago, how did the flat viewing go? Landlord still asking for 6 months up front? Marcus, fine. Sorted. Won't need it much longer anyway if this works. V. Don't get ahead of yourself. UKVI don't care how in love you look in the photos, they care about the paper trail. Joint bills, joint account, the lot. You need at least a year of it before you file. Marcus, I know how it works, V. It's not my first time round this particular block. I read that line 4 times. Not my first time round this particular block. I remember the particular sensation of the words arriving in my body before my mind had finished processing them, a cold drop, low in the stomach, entirely physical, the kind of shock that bypasses thought altogether and simply announces itself in the flesh. I kept reading. The thread ran to hundreds of messages, and I did not, in the 20 minutes I allowed myself before I had to be back inside for my hair appointment, read all of them, but I read enough. Enough to understand that Marcus Vane's visa, a work visa granted 3 years earlier, tied to a job he had in fact left after 11 months, a fact he had never once mentioned to me, had expired the previous autumn, and that he had been, since then, in the country illegally, a fact concealed from everyone including, apparently, most of his own friends. Enough to understand that the entire relationship, from the exhibition in Bristol onward, had been constructed, with the patient, methodical attention of a man who had, the phone confirmed it, in a message from 3 months into our courtship, she's exactly the profile we need, V, sweet, a bit naive, owns her own flat outright, no family solicitor breathing down her neck like the last one, done this before. There had been a last one. There was, apparently, a V, whose full identity I did not yet know, coaching him through the mechanics of a spousal visa application with the crisp, professional efficiency of somebody who had guided this particular con through its paces more than once. And then, near the bottom of the thread, dated 11 days earlier, the message that made me set the phone down on the stone wall beside me and simply breathe, for a moment, before I could pick it up again. V, nervous about Saturday? Marcus, a bit. She's a sweet girl. I don't love doing this to her. V, you never do. You always say that. Then you spend her honeymoon money on flights to see me and it stops mattering so much, doesn't it? Marcus, don't. V, I'll see you at the reception. Try not to look at me like that in front of 140 guests, darling, we've discussed this. I'll see you at the reception. V was coming to my wedding. V, whoever she was, had a seat, a name on a place card, somewhere among the 140 guests I had spent 4 months seating and reseating on a spreadsheet with my mother, arguing over whether Great Aunt Pauline could be trusted at the same table as my father's second wife. I scrolled back through the earlier messages until I found what I was, by then, already dreading, a photograph, sent 8 weeks before, of a woman laughing at a restaurant table, dark-haired, perhaps my own age, captioned only with a single word from Marcus, miss you. I recognized the restaurant. I recognized, a moment later, with a second, quieter cold drop entirely distinct from the first, the woman's face. It was Ffion. Ffion Pryce had been my closest friend since our second week at Bristol University, 12 years before, when we had been assigned to the same dismal student house on Cotham Hill and bonded, in the particular ferocious way of 19-year-olds thrown together by a housing lottery, over a shared loathing of the landlord and a shared taste in terrible nightclubs. She had been my maid of honor. She had helped me choose the dress. She had sat beside me at every dress fitting, every cake tasting, every increasingly fraught conversation about the seating plan, offering opinions with the easy, generous confidence of a woman entirely on my side. She had, I now understood, introduced me to Marcus in the first place, had brought him to the exhibition opening in Bristol as her +1, had mentioned him to me twice in the fortnight before, in the careful, offhand way of a woman planting a seed she intends to appear entirely accidental. "There's a friend of a friend coming tonight, actually rather good company, you should meet him." I sat on that stone wall in my wedding dress and did the arithmetic that no bride should ever have to do 2 hours before her own ceremony, and arrived, with the horrible clean clarity of a woman whose professional life has trained her to notice exactly this kind of pattern, at the shape of the whole thing. Ffion had found him. Ffion had introduced him to me, at an event she had specifically brought him to. Ffion had spent 18 months as my closest confidant, my maid of honor, the woman I had cried to twice when Marcus had been distant and unreachable for reasons I now understood perfectly, and had been, the entire time, not merely aware of the scheme but in it, the V of the second phone, the woman he missed, the woman who would be sitting, that very afternoon, at table 4, 3 seats down from my own mother, in a dress she had helped me choose so that it would not, God forbid, clash with her own. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it matters to what I did next, and because I have come to distrust stories about betrayed brides that skip straight from discovery to composure, as though grief and fury simply evaporate the instant a woman decides to be clever about her revenge. I did not feel clever, sitting on that wall. I felt, for perhaps 4 full minutes, exactly as gutted and as ordinary as any woman would feel discovering, 2 hours before her wedding, that her fiancé and her closest friend had spent 18 months constructing an elaborate fraud around the single most significant relationship of her adult life. I cried. I am not ashamed of that. I sat in the gravel car park of Fenwick Hall in a dress that had cost more than my first car and cried the particular ugly, silent tears of a woman trying very hard not to smudge her own wedding makeup even in the middle of the worst 4 minutes of her life, because some absurd, stubborn part of my mind was already, even then, thinking 2 steps ahead. Then I stopped, and I looked at the phone in my lap, and I did the thing that I think, in the end, is the only genuinely useful skill 11 years of film editing had actually given me. I began, very calmly, to photograph every single message on that screen, in order, with careful attention to the timestamps. I did not telephone Marcus. I did not march into the church, where he was, by then, already waiting with his best man and his father and a photographer capturing the getting ready shots that would later appear, absurdly, in the wedding album alongside photographs of me looking, in my own before shots, entirely radiant and entirely unaware. I did not telephone my mother, though God knows I wanted to, because I understood, even in the wreckage of that car park, that my mother's fury, once summoned, would be a force of nature entirely beyond my control, and that this, whatever this was going to become, needed control above almost everything else. I did not cancel the wedding. I want to explain that decision properly, because I know it will strike some people as strange, even as a kind of madness, and because it was, I promise you, the single most deliberate choice I have ever made in my life. If I canceled the ceremony that morning, if I sent word to the church that there would be no wedding, packed my dress away, and drove home to my mother's house to nurse the wound in private, Marcus Vane would have lost nothing but an afternoon's embarrassment and a deposit on a marquee. He would have driven back to whatever flat he was renting that month, deleted the second phone, and been engaged to somebody else within a year, coached by the same patient, practiced V, running the same careful 18-month con on some other sweet, naive woman with her own flat and no family solicitor breathing down her neck. Canceling would have protected precisely nothing except my own pride, for precisely 1 afternoon, and would have left him entirely free to do this again. I did not intend to let that happen. I took out my own phone, sitting on that stone wall with my makeup ruined in my hands. I noticed with something close to detached professional interest, entirely steady, and I telephoned my brother, Tom, who ran the sound and lighting for half the weddings and corporate events in the West Country and who was, that particular Saturday, not working a job of his own and had agreed, weeks earlier, to help set up the AV equipment at Fenwick Hall as a favor, because Tom had always been better with a laptop and a mixing desk than with almost any other tool life had put in his hands, and because Tom, more than almost anybody else alive, understood exactly what it meant when his sister said, in a voice she was working very hard to keep level, "I need you to help me change the slideshow, and I need you not to ask me why until after." Tom was in the AV cupboard behind the ballroom within 11 minutes, having told the venue coordinator he needed a quiet word with the bride about timings, a lie so mundane nobody thought to question it, and I met him there, still in my dress, having told my own hairdresser, waiting upstairs, that I needed 5 minutes to sort something with my brother, a sentence that was, in its own strange way, entirely true. I do not think I have ever worked faster, or with greater clarity, in my professional life. 11 years of cutting other people's footage into stories that told the truth more precisely than the raw material ever could on its own had prepared me, without my ever intending it, for exactly this. I had, on the laptop already loaded with my original slideshow, 18 months of photographs, the two of us on the cliff path at Lyme Regis, the two of us at Christmas, the two of us laughing at 100 small, ordinary, apparently happy moments that I now understood I had been documenting. For a story that was never the one I thought I was living, and I had, on my own phone, screenshot after screenshot of the second phone's messages, timestamped, unambiguous, in Marcus's own words and the words of the woman he called V. I did not delete the original slideshow. That, I think, was the choice that made the final version work as well as it did. I kept every one of those photographs of the two of us, laughing, apparently in love, and I simply began, roughly 2/3 of the way through the sequence, to intercut them, in the same soft, gentle rhythm the whole film had established, with the messages. The same warm, unhurried pacing. The same wedding-appropriate piano music underneath, which I had chosen, months earlier, entirely without irony, because I had thought it sounded like the beginning of a happy life. I built it exactly the way I would have built any piece of work I actually cared about doing well, with restraint. I did not want it to look like fury, however much fury was, in fact, exactly what I felt. I wanted it to look, when it played, like precisely what it was, evidence, laid out in plain chronological order, allowed to speak for itself, because I understood, even in the white heat of that hour, that 140 guests would believe a calm, well-ordered sequence of dated messages a great deal more readily than they would believe a screaming bride, and that Marcus Vane's only real defense, in the moment the truth arrived, would be to make me look hysterical. I was not going to give him that. Tom watched over my shoulder without speaking for most of it, his face going through several distinct stages of horror as the messages scrolled past, and said, when I finally sat back from the laptop with 4 minutes to spare before I was due back upstairs, "Only, Lottie. Are you actually going to go through with the ceremony?" "Yes," I said. "Why?" I looked at him, at my brother, who had known Marcus for 18 months and had, like everyone else, found him perfectly good company, and who was looking at me now with an expression I had not seen on his face since we were children and he'd caught me, aged 9, calmly and methodically dismantling a wasp's nest that had been terrorizing our garden with a garden fork and a can of petrol, entirely without asking anybody's permission, because I had decided, even then, that some problems were better solved thoroughly than quickly. Because, I said, if I walk away now, he gets to try this again with somebody else. If I marry him, and then I expose him, in front of 140 witnesses, with a paper trail dated and time-stamped and impossible to explain away, and then I have the marriage annulled for fraud the following week with every one of those witnesses available to give evidence to a court, he doesn't get to try this again. Not easily. Not without every single person in that church being available to tell the Home Office exactly what kind of man he is. Tom was quiet for a moment. That's rather cold, Lottie. Yes, I agreed. I rather think it needs to be. I will not pretend that walking down the aisle of that small stone church an hour later, on my father's arm, past 140 smiling faces including my own mother's, dabbing already at happy tears, was easy. I will not pretend that looking at Marcus Vane, waiting for me at the altar in the morning suit I had helped him choose, smiling the same open, easy smile that had undone me at an exhibition 18 months before, did not require every ounce of composure I had ever built in a decade of professional life spent staying calm and editing suites at 3 in the morning with directors screaming down the phone about deadlines. I found Fion's face in the third pew, radiant in the pale green dress she'd chosen so it wouldn't clash, and I smiled at her, briefly, the same smile I had given her at every dress fitting, and I do not think, even now, that she suspected anything at all, because I had spent 11 years learning to control exactly what my face revealed on a screen, and I put every one of those years to use in the space of that single smile. I said my vows. I want to be precise about this, because I think it matters. I did not lie during them. I promised to be honest with Marcus Vane, and I have never, before or since, told a truer thing to a more undeserving audience, because I understood, standing at that altar, that the vow itself would become, within a few hours, the single most useful piece of leverage I possessed, a legally solemnized marriage, entered into by me in good faith and by him in calculated fraud, which is, as any family solicitor will confirm, one of the cleanest possible grounds for an immediate annulment. Considerably cleaner and considerably faster than the 18-month slog of a fraudulent divorce that Marcus and Ffion had, I imagine, always assumed would be their worst-case exit strategy. He said his vows too, smiling the whole time, and I watched his mouth shape the words for better or for worse with a steadiness that told me, more clearly than anything on the second phone had, exactly what kind of practice he had had at saying things he did not mean. We were married at 12:30. We had our photographs taken on the south lawn, in the June sunshine, and I smiled in every single one of them, and if you look at that album today, I am told my mother still has it, somewhere, though I have never asked to see it again. You would not know, from my face in a single frame, that I had spent the previous 2 hours building the instrument of my own husband's public destruction in a cupboard behind the ballroom with my brother standing guard at the door. The speeches began at 3:30, after the meal, in the marquee on the south lawn with its white canvas walls glowing gold in the afternoon light, and I had arranged, weeks earlier, entirely without knowing what use it would eventually serve, for the slideshow to run immediately after the best man's speech, before the first dance, the traditional moment, the one every guest at every wedding expects and half watches on their phones while finishing their coffee, a gentle montage of the happy couple set to music, over in 4 or 5 minutes, applauded politely, forgotten by the following week. The best man, Marcus's oldest friend from a life I now understood I had barely glimpsed the edges of, gave a speech full of the usual affectionate, half-true anecdotes, and I sat beside my new husband at the top table and laughed in all the right places, and felt, throughout, the strange dual awareness of a woman watching a film she has already seen, waiting for the scene she knows is coming. Tom dimmed the lights at exactly 4 o'clock. The screens, there were 2, one at each end of the marquee, mounted on the sort of tall stands venues like Fenwick Hall keep for exactly this purpose, flickered to life with the opening image of the slideshow, Marcus and me on the cliff path above Lyme Regis, the wind in my hair, both of us laughing at something now lost to memory, the piano music beginning underneath, soft and warm and entirely ordinary, exactly as 140 guests expected it to be. I watched their faces, not the screen, for the first 90 seconds, watched my mother's hand find my father's on the table, watched Ffion, 3 seats down, smiling with what I now understood to be genuine, practiced, entirely convincing warmth, watched Marcus, beside me, relax visibly, the tension he'd been holding all day easing out of his shoulders because the slideshow, so far, was exactly the slideshow he'd seen when I showed him a rough cut in April, and he had, I imagine, no reason whatsoever to expect anything different. The photographs continued for perhaps 2.5 minutes, genuinely, I promise you, some of the happiest images of my adult life, because the strange, terrible truth of it is that I had been happy in almost every one of them, whatever the man beside me had actually been doing with the time between the shutter clicks, and then, exactly as I had built it in that cupboard with Tom standing silent behind me, the music did not stop, but the images changed. The first screenshot appeared exactly where a new photograph would ordinarily have appeared, in the same soft, gentle fade, the same warm piano continuing underneath, B, do not answer in front of C timestamped. Unmistakable. I heard, rather than saw, the marquee begin to understand. A single gasp, near the front, quickly smothered. A chair scraping. My mother's hand tightening on my father's, this time not in happiness. The messages continued, in the same unhurried rhythm as the photographs before them, each one held on screen just long enough to be read twice by anyone paying proper attention, which, by the third message, was every single person in that tent. Not my first time round this particular block. She's exactly the profile we need, V, sweet, a bit naive. The restaurant photograph, Ffion laughing, captioned miss you, held on screen for a full 8 seconds while I watched, from the corner of my eye, the exact moment my closest friend of 12 years understood that her face was being projected 8 feet high onto a screen in front of everyone she had ever met from my side of the wedding. And then, last, the final message, the one I had built the whole sequence towards, the one I wanted to be the very last thing that 140 guests read before the lights came back up, I'll see you at the reception. Try not to look at me like that in front of 140 guests, darling, we've discussed this. The screen faded to black. The piano music, which I had let run the whole way through, on purpose, because I wanted it to sound exactly as sincere and exactly as warm at the end as it had at the beginning, resolved gently to its final chord and stopped. I stood up before anyone else in that marquee had recovered enough to move. I had rehearsed nothing, in the strict sense, there had been no time, in the 2 hours between the car park and the ceremony, to write and memorize a speech, but I had spent 11 years standing in editing suites explaining, calmly and precisely, exactly why a particular cut worked, exactly what story a particular sequence of images told, and I found, standing there in my wedding dress with 140 faces turned towards me in various states of horror, that the skill translated rather better than I could have hoped. I found a second phone in my husband's car 2 hours ago, I said, and my voice, to my own considerable surprise, did not shake at all. I want to be clear that everything you've just seen is real. Every message is dated. Every screenshot has a timestamp. I have copies, and so does my solicitor, as of 40 minutes ago, and so, as it happens, does the Immigration Enforcement Hotline, because a man whose visa expired 8 months ago does not get to solve that problem by marrying a woman under false pretenses, whatever his previous experience with the arrangement. I let that land, watching Marcus's face, for the first time all day, lose its composure entirely. I want to thank everyone here for witnessing this marriage. I mean that quite sincerely. You are, as of about 20 minutes ago, extremely useful witnesses, and my solicitor will very likely be in touch with several of you next week regarding a rather straightforward annulment on the grounds of fraudulent misrepresentation. I turned, then, to Ffion, who had not moved from her chair, her face the color of the tablecloth. "I don't have anything to say to you that would improve on what's already on that screen," I told her, "except that I hope, whatever you and Marcus imagined the two of you were going to do with my honeymoon money, it was worth 12 years of friendship, because I promise you, it was not." I took off my wedding ring. I had thought about this moment, in the strange, suspended calm of the ceremony itself, and had decided it needed to be simple, needed to be the last image rather than a dramatic flourish, needed no shouting at all, and set it down, quite gently, on the white tablecloth in front of Marcus Vane's untouched dessert, and I said, to the Marquis generally, in the same level voice I had used throughout, "The bar is open for another 2 hours, and I understand the caterers have already been paid, so please, do stay and enjoy the evening. I'm terribly sorry it isn't the wedding you came for." And then I picked up the skirt of my dress, exactly as I had 2 hours earlier in the gravel car park, and I walked out of the Marquis, past the astonished catering staff, past the string quartet who had stopped playing entirely somewhere around the fourth screenshot, out onto the south lawn in the June evening light, with my mother and my brother falling into step on either side of me without either of them needing to be asked. And I did not look back once. I want to set down, as precisely as I can remember it, what happened in the Marquis in the 2 minutes after I walked out, because I did not see any of it myself, and everything I know about it I have pieced together since, from Tom, from my father, and once, much later and rather reluctantly, from the best man himself, who telephoned me 8 months on to apologize for a toast he said he could no longer read back in his own head without wanting to be sick. Marcus did not go after me. This, I think, tells you almost everything you need to know about the sort of man he was, that in the single most consequential moment of his own wedding day, faced with a Marquis full of witnesses and a wife who had just publicly and irreversibly ended him, his first instinct was not to chase, not to explain, not even to perform outrage, but to reach, according to my father, for his own ordinary phone and begin, with what my father described as the calm of a man checking a train timetable. Scrolling through his contacts, as though already working out where he might go next. Ffion, by contrast, according to Tom, who had come back into the Marquis from the AV cupboard just in time to see it, stood up so fast her chair went over backwards, and said, to the table at large, in a voice that cracked halfway through, "This isn't, you don't understand, it isn't what it," before stopping entirely, because there was, in truth, no sentence available to her that could have finished that thought in any direction that helped her, and she left, alone, on foot, down the long gravel drive of Fenwick Hall, before anyone thought to offer her a lift. My father, who had walked me down the aisle 3 hours earlier with what he later admitted was the proudest he had ever felt in his life, crossed the Marquis to the top table, picked up the ring I had left beside Marcus's dessert, and, this detail I have from 3 separate witnesses, all of whom describe it slightly differently but agree entirely on the substance, did not shout, did not throw a punch, though he is by his own admission not an unathletic man even at 61, but simply looked at Marcus Vane for a long moment and said, quietly enough that only the top table heard it, "You will leave this building in the next 10 minutes, and if I ever see you within a mile of my daughter again, the immigration hotline will be the very least of your concerns." Marcus left within 6. The best man, when he telephoned me 8 months later, told me that the strangest part of the whole afternoon, for him, had been the ordinary business of the reception simply continuing around the wreckage of it, the caterers, already paid, quietly clearing plates 20 minutes later as though nothing at all had happened, the string quartet, after a hushed conference among themselves, deciding to keep playing because nobody had told them not to, a handful of guests, my mother's cousins. Mostly, apparently still eating pudding an hour later, discussing the whole business in low, delighted whispers, because a wedding, Once it has become the most extraordinary story any of its guests will tell for the next decade, is very difficult for anybody to actually leave. It was my mother, in the car on the way home that evening, still in her mother of the bride hat, who told me something I had not known, and which I have thought about a great deal since. "I had him checked," she said, quite simply, staring straight ahead through the windscreen as my father drove. "8 months ago. A friend of your father's does a bit of private investigation work, nothing dramatic, mostly for insurance companies. I asked him to have a quiet look at Marcus. Just the basics, employment history, that sort of thing." "You did what?" "I found out his work visa had lapsed," my mother said, in exactly the tone she had once used to inform me, aged 15, that she had found cigarettes in my school bag. "I didn't know about the rest of it. The other woman, whatever this business turns out to be, God only knows how far back that goes. But I knew about the visa, Lottie, back in October, and I told your father, and we talked about it for 3 days, and in the end we decided not to say anything to you." "Why on earth not?" My mother turned, finally, to look at me, and there was something in her face I had not expected, not guilt, exactly, but something close to it, worn thin by 8 months of carrying a secret she had clearly hoped, right up until that afternoon, she would never have to explain. "Because you were so happy, darling. Because the one time your father tried to raise a concern about a boyfriend, when you were 23, about that dreadful Simon, you didn't speak to either of us for 4 months, and I decided I would rather watch you find things out for yourself, in your own time, than lose you over telling you something you weren't ready to hear. I told myself I would keep watching, and if it ever looked as though it was truly going to happen, the wedding, I mean, without you ever learning the truth, I would say something before the day itself, whatever it cost us." She looked back at the road. "I am not entirely sure I would have kept that promise, if I'm honest with you. I have been dreading this month for 8 months, and some very large part of me is grateful, God forgive me, that you found it yourself, in a car park, with 2 hours to spare, rather than me having to be the one to tell you at the worst possible moment. I sat with that, in the back of my parents' car, still in my wedding dress, for the better part of 10 miles, before I said, 'You should have told me, Mum.'" "I know," she said. I've had rather a long afternoon to arrive at the same conclusion. I have forgiven her for it, in the years since, though it took longer than I would like to admit, because I understood, eventually, that she had made exactly the kind of impossible calculation every parent makes at some point about a grown child no longer entirely theirs to protect, and had simply guessed wrong about which risk was the greater one. I have thought, too, about how differently that whole final hour might have unfolded if she'd guessed the other way, if I had learnt, in October, over a quiet dinner, that my fiancé's visa had lapsed, and had confronted him then, gently, in private, with no marquee, no second phone, no 18 months of quietly documented evidence, no 140 witnesses. I think, on balance, he would have talked his way out of it. I think Ffion would have helped him do it, would have sat across from me with exactly the same warm, convincing face she wore in the third pew, and I think I would very possibly have believed them both, because I had not yet found the second phone, had not yet read 14 months of his own words in his own hand, describing exactly what I was. I am not glad, precisely, that it happened the way it did. But I have made my peace with the fact that the version of the truth I actually received, undeniable, dated, delivered to 140 witnesses in a single unbroken sequence with no opportunity for either of them to talk their way around it, was very possibly the only version that could ever have made him leave the country without a fight, which he did, in the end, 11 weeks later, once the annulment was through and the immigration authorities had finished asking questions that Marcus Vane, for what I understand, was very nearly the first time in his adult life, found himself entirely unable to charm his way past. I learnt, in the months that followed, a good deal more about V than I had ever wanted to know, most of it through Tom, who had, in the strange small world way of the West Country wedding circuit, done sound for 2 other events she had attended over the years, and who remembered her, once he thought to look properly, as a woman who had a habit of turning up at weddings where the groom seemed, in Tom's own words, a bit too smooth for his own good. Her name was Victoria Sallow, and she was not, as I had half expected in the raw fury of that first week, some professional criminal running an organized racket. She was, by all accounts, simply a woman in her late 30s who had met Marcus Vane 9 years earlier, fallen in with him properly some 4 years after that, and discovered, somewhere along the way, that the two of them together had a particular, ugly talent for exactly this, finding sweet, slightly naive, financially independent women, coaching a plausible romance into being over 12 or 18 careful months, and riding it as far as it would go before either the visa came through or the woman in question grew suspicious enough to end things first, at which point Marcus would simply move on, apologetic, heartbroken seeming, entirely blameless in his own telling, to the next city, the next exhibition opening, the next sweet and slightly naive woman with her own flat and no family solicitor breathing down her neck. I found, through a solicitor my own solicitor recommended, a woman in Leeds named Priya Desai who had very nearly married Marcus Vane 4 years before me, and had, in fact, called the whole thing off 3 weeks before her own wedding after a friend, not Victoria, on that occasion, but somebody else entirely, which told me rather a lot about how many times this particular routine had been run, had grown suspicious and done some quiet digging of her own. Priya and I met for coffee in Leeds on a wet October afternoon, and compared notes, and I do not think I have ever felt less alone in my life than I did sitting across that small cafe table from a woman who understood, without my needing to explain a single detail, exactly what the previous 18 months of my life had actually been. He never even changed his opening line, she told me, with a short, disbelieving laugh that had almost no humor in it at all. The grandmother. The sea lock. He told me the exact same story, word for word, at a gallery in Chelsea 9 years ago. She shook her head. I always wondered whether there ever was a grandmother, or a lock, or any of it. I never asked, I said. I don't suppose it matters now. No, Priya agreed. I don't suppose it does. We have kept in touch, Priya and I, in the loose, occasional way of two people bound together by something neither of us would have chosen, and it was Priya, in fact, who first suggested, over a second coffee that same wet October afternoon, that between the two of us we very likely had enough documented evidence, her own solicitor's file from 4 years earlier, my own screenshots and the court record of the annulment, to make it considerably harder for Marcus Vane to run the same routine a third time in whatever country he had by then washed up in. We never learnt, in the end, precisely what became of him after he left the country. My solicitor believed, from the little that filtered back through the immigration case file, that he had gone first to Ireland and then, some months later, to somewhere in mainland Europe where the same visa complications did not immediately follow him, but I have chosen, on the whole, not to spend very much of my remaining life wondering. Some stories, I have found, are more useful closed than followed to their final page. I did not, in the end, keep the wedding album, though I understand my mother has held on to it, tucked away somewhere in a cupboard I have never asked to see. I do not need the photographs. I have something better, I think, though it is not the kind of thing anybody would ever choose to have. I have 4 minutes and 40 seconds of edited footage, sitting on a hard drive in a box in my own flat, that I have watched exactly twice since that afternoon, once, alone, 3 months later, to make sure my hands had stopped shaking every time I thought about it, and once, a year after that, At the invitation of a friend from a professional editing forum who was putting together, of all things, a masterclass on documentary structure, and asked, half as a joke, whether I had ever cut anything under genuinely extreme pressure. I did not tell her the whole story. I told her only that I had once built a 4-minute sequence in under 2 hours, under circumstances I would rather not discuss, and that it remained, whatever else I had done in 11 years of professional work, the single best piece of editing I had ever produced, because it was the only piece of work in my entire career in which every single choice, the pacing, the music, the order, the very last image left on screen before the lights came up had mattered more than anything I had ever cut before or have cut since. I am engaged again now, to a man named David who runs a small independent cinema in Bristol and who knew, from our second date onward, the whole of what happened at Fenwick Hall, because I told him myself, plainly, over dinner, on the theory that any man who could not sit across a table from that story and still want a second date was not a man worth a third one. He listened to the whole of it without once looking away, and when I finished, he said only, "Remind me never to leave a second phone anywhere you might find it," which struck me, at the time, as exactly the right thing to say, and which I have found, in the 2 years since, to remain more or less permanently true. David proposed properly, on an ordinary Sunday, in the kitchen of his own flat with 2 mugs of tea going cold on the counter, no cliff path, no rehearsed line about a grandmother he may or may not have had, and I said yes for the second time in my life with, I am glad to report, considerably less breathlessness and a great deal more certainty than the first. My mother cried again, though for entirely better reasons this time, and my father, when David asked his permission beforehand in the old-fashioned way David insists on doing everything, apparently said only, "Just don't leave anything in your glove box you wouldn't want her to find," which David took, correctly, as a blessing. We are not having a slideshow at our wedding. David suggested it, gently, as a joke, the first time we discussed the guest list, and I laughed, properly, for what I think was the first time either of us had made a joke about that particular afternoon, and told him that I thought, on the whole, I had made quite enough use of that particular piece of technology to last me the rest of my natural life. I kept the ring, in the end, not Marcus's ring, which I returned, by post, without comment, the week after the annulment came through, but the small, plain gold band I bought myself the following spring, entirely alone, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and where now on my right hand, where it sits beside nothing else at all, as a reminder, whenever I need one, of the particular afternoon I learnt that the truth, told plainly, in the right order, at the right volume, in front of the right witnesses, needs no embellishment whatsoever to do exactly what it was always going to do.